In a peaceful park, Isaiah Thompson, a calm and composed man, finds himself at the center of an unexpected confrontation when Officer David Cross, driven by suspicion and unchecked biases, arrests him without cause. What unfolds is a tense encounter that forces both men, especially Cross, to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice and accountability. As the consequences of the arrest ripple through the police department, it sparks a deeper conversation about justice, systemic issues in law enforcement, and the need for meaningful change. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a soft golden light over the park. It was the kind of day people dream of, warm with a light breeze that kept the temperature from being unbearable. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their leaves rustling like whispers, while the scent of freshly cut grass filled the air. The park was alive with activity, children laughing as they chased each other around the playground, joggers weaving through the winding paths, and families enjoying picnics on the open lawns. It was an ordinary day in an ordinary park, a haven of tranquility amidst the chaos of the city. Isaiah Thompson sat alone on a worn wooden bench beneath the shade of a large oak tree. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s, his skin dark and his presence unassuming. Dressed casually in a fitted gray t-shirt and jeans, he didn't stand out, blending into the landscape of the park like any other visitor. His posture was relaxed, yet upright, a reflection of his disciplined nature. His hands held a well-thumbed paperback, its pages yellowed from use. The cover was worn and faded, a testament to the many times he had read and reread the novel. Today he was engrossed in it, losing himself in the story's twists and turns, the park fading into the background. Isaiah was a man who relished moments like these, moments of peace and quiet, where he could escape the weight of his responsibilities. Few people knew the extent of his work, the pressures he faced daily as a high-ranking agent with the FBI. His job often thrust him into high-stress, high-stakes situations where quick thinking and sharp decision-making could mean the difference between life and death. But here, on this bench, none of that mattered. He wasn't Agent Thompson, the man who people looked to in moments of crisis. He was just Isaiah, a man with a book, enjoying a rare afternoon off. As he read, Isaiah remained vaguely aware of the world around him. His training made it impossible for him to fully relax, to ever truly let his guard down. He noticed the jogger passing by every few minutes, his bright red shoes kicking up small clouds of dust from the path. He noticed the couple walking their dog, chatting quietly as they strolled along the edge of the pond. He even noticed the teenager sitting on a nearby bench, earbuds in, lost in their own world. These were the details that most people overlooked, but not Isaiah. His mind was always working, always observing, even when he appeared to be at ease. But today, those observations were filed away in the back of his mind, unimportant in the grand scheme of things. Isaiah turned the page of his novel, his eyes flicking over the words with a quiet intensity. The world of the story pulled him in, offering a temporary escape from the reality of his life. Here under the shade of the oak tree, Isaiah could breathe. He could forget, even if just for a little while, the pressures that awaited him back at the office. Little did Isaiah know that while he sat there, a pair of eyes had fixed on him from across the park. Officer David Cross sat in his squad car, the engine idling as he watched the scene unfold in front of him. He was parked near the entrance of the park, his patrol car facing the open expanse of green. Cross was a man in his late 40s, with a face that had hardened over the years, etched with lines of stress and tension from his long career in law enforcement. He wore dark aviator sunglasses that obscured his eyes, giving him an air of intimidation, and his jaw was clenched in a permanent scowl. Cross was a veteran cop, having spent over 2 decades on the force, patrolling these very streets day in and day out. He had seen it all, or at least he liked to think he had. On the surface, Cross appeared calm, but inside his instincts were buzzing with suspicion. His gaze was fixed on Isaiah, watching the man sitting alone on the bench. To Cross, something about Isaiah didn't sit right. It wasn't anything overt, but Cross had long ago learned to trust his gut feelings. And right now, his gut was telling him that Isaiah was out of place. Cross wasn't sure what exactly it was that bothered him. Maybe it was the way Isaiah sat alone, so still and composed when everyone else in the park seemed to be moving, talking, interacting. Maybe it was that Isaiah wasn't doing anything to draw attention to himself. That in itself, in Cross's mind, was suspicious. Or maybe it was just the fact that Isaiah was a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood. Cross would never have admitted that last part out loud, but the thought lingered in the back of his mind, unspoken but undeniably present. Earlier in the day, Cross had heard a vague radio call about a suspicious individual spotted in the area. The description was thin, male, late 20s or early 30s, possibly black, wearing casual clothes. That could describe dozens of people in the park, but as Cross watched Isaiah, he convinced himself that this man fit the description. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but in Cross's eyes, he didn't belong here, and that was enough to raise his suspicion. Cross had been an officer long enough to believe in his own instincts, even when those instincts weren't backed by any real evidence. He had spent years dealing with crime, dealing with problematic individuals, and in his mind, he had developed a sixth sense for trouble. To him, this was just another example of that instinct kicking in. And his instincts told him that Isaiah was up to something. Cross didn't have any proof, but that didn't matter. He was sure he was right. With a sigh, Cross turned off the engine of his patrol car and stepped out, adjusting his belt as he did so. He was a tall, stocky man with a hard face, the kind of face that demanded respect, or so he believed. As he started walking toward Isaiah, his eyes never left the man on the bench. Cross's walk was purposeful, his posture rigid, exuding authority with every step. He had handled situations like this 100 times before, approaching someone, questioning them, making his presence known. It was part of the job, part of what kept the city in line. Isaiah, still reading his book, was unaware of Cross's approach at first. The world of the novel had fully absorbed him, pulling him deeper into its narrative. But as Cross neared, the subtle change in the atmosphere caught Isaiah's attention. He felt the shift in the air, the way the park seemed to grow quieter, the way the energy around him became more focused. Without looking up, Isaiah sensed someone approaching, and his mind immediately switched out of relaxation mode. His instincts, honed through years of FBI training, kicked in. When Cross was just a few steps away, Isaiah finally looked up from his book, his dark eyes meeting the officers behind those tinted sunglasses. For a moment, neither man spoke. The tension between them was subtle, but it was there, an undercurrent of unease that both men could feel. "Afternoon," Cross said, his voice flat and emotionless. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his feet planted firmly on the ground, as if to establish his authority before he even said anything further. Isaiah closed his book, resting it on his lap, and looked up at the officer with a calm, measured expression. "Afternoon, officer," he replied, his tone polite but neutral. Isaiah had dealt with law enforcement enough times to know the drill. He could sense where this was heading, even if nothing had been said outright yet. "I need to see some ID," Cross said, cutting straight to the point. He made no effort to explain why, no attempt to offer any reasoning for the request. It was a command, delivered with the assumption that it would be followed without question. Isaiah blinked, his expression unchanged, though inside he felt a flicker of irritation. He'd been through this kind of encounter before, too many times in fact, but he also knew better than to let it get under his skin. His first instinct was to remain calm, to stay composed. That was how he had been trained, and that was how he handled situations like these. Still, he wasn't about to hand over his ID without knowing why he was being asked. "Is there a reason you need to see my ID?" Isaiah asked, keeping his voice steady and polite. His eyes didn't waver from Cross's face, even though the officer's sunglasses prevented him from reading the man's full expression. He knew this question would likely provoke a reaction, but he wasn't going to let himself be intimidated. Cross's jaw tightened at the question, his posture stiffening just slightly. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone he was already suspicious of. In his mind, Isaiah's calmness only made him more suspicious. Why wasn't this man nervous? Why wasn't he scrambling to comply? To Cross, it was a sign that Isaiah was hiding something, that he was trying to outsmart him. "I don't need to explain myself," Cross said, his tone sharper now. "Just show me your ID." Isaiah sighed quietly, his patience wearing thin but his composure intact. He wasn't in the mood for this. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but he also knew that resisting would only make things worse. "Officer," Isaiah said, his voice calm, "I'm just sitting here reading a book. I don't see why my ID is necessary unless I'm being detained for something." Cross's temper flared at that. He had heard enough. To him, this was no longer just a routine check. This was now a challenge to his authority. His hand hovered near his belt, where his handcuffs were clipped, as he stepped closer to Isaiah. "You're acting suspicious," Cross snapped. "And if you don't show me your ID right now, I'll take you down to the station." Isaiah knew that there was no reasoning with Cross at this point. The situation had escalated beyond logic or fairness. But even in the face of the officer's aggression, Isaiah remained calm. He didn't rise from the bench, didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he met Cross's gaze with steady resolve. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Isaiah said quietly, his tone measured. "I don't think this is necessary." Cross's patience snapped. Without another word, he reached down and grabbed Isaiah's arm, yanking him up from the bench with unnecessary force. Isaiah didn't resist, but the suddenness of the movement startled him. Before he could react, Cross had his handcuffs out, roughly pulling Isaiah's wrist behind his back and locking the cold metal cuffs around them. Back at the precinct, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the sterile, gray-tiled floors, and rows of desks cluttered with papers, coffee mugs, and radios crackling with bits of conversation. It was business as usual for the officers going about their routine tasks, typing up reports, chatting among themselves, and occasionally glancing at the clock, counting the minutes until their shifts ended. Isaiah Thompson was led through the precinct by Officer David Cross, his wrists still bound in the cold, uncomfortable cuffs. The station's usual noise faded in the background as Isaiah kept his head held high, his expression calm and composed despite the unjust arrest. He had been through far more tense and dangerous situations in his career with the FBI, but the weight of this experience was something different. This wasn't about crime or law enforcement. It was about a deep-seated prejudice that had nothing to do with the rule of law and everything to do with the color of his skin. Isaiah could feel the eyes of the officers on him as he was brought to the booking area. They watched him as he walked in, their conversations pausing momentarily as they observed the latest person being processed. Some of them glanced at each other, puzzled, while others went back to their tasks, uninterested in whatever petty crime they assumed this man had committed. No one questioned Cross. No one asked what Isaiah had done to warrant being hauled in like a criminal. They simply accepted it as part of the day's routine. As Cross began the process of booking Isaiah, typing up details into the computer with the same detached efficiency he used for all his arrests, something in the air shifted. Officer Tom Edwards entered the room, a fellow officer who had been with the precinct for several years. Edwards was a quiet, observant man, not prone to making waves or getting involved in conflicts that didn't concern him. He had always been more of a background presence, content to do his job and keep his head down. But today, something unusual caught his attention. Edwards froze mid-step when his eyes fell on Isaiah. Recognition flickered in his face, his expression turning from casual indifference to surprise. He knew exactly who Isaiah was. Unlike Cross, who had acted purely on assumptions and bias, Edwards had attended a department-wide training session a few months ago where Isaiah had been a guest speaker. Isaiah had been brought in as an FBI agent to talk about collaboration between federal and local law enforcement, particularly in cases involving terrorism and organized crime. He had spoken about his experiences in the field, his calm demeanor and sharp intellect leaving a strong impression on those who attended. Edwards, like many of his colleagues, had admired Isaiah's professionalism and the respect he commanded in the room. Now, seeing Isaiah in handcuffs, standing in the booking area like a common criminal, Edwards couldn't believe his eyes. He hesitated for a moment, glancing from Isaiah to Cross, trying to make sense of what was happening. How had things gone so wrong? He knew Isaiah wasn't some random civilian causing trouble in the park. He was an FBI agent, a man who had likely been through far more intense situations than most of the officers in this station could even imagine. But Edwards said nothing, his mind racing as he considered what to do. Cross seemed completely unaware of who he had just arrested, continuing to input information into the system, his face set in a look of self-satisfaction. Edwards knew that saying something now, in front of the other officers, might escalate things further. He wasn't sure what Cross's reaction would be, and he didn't want to embarrass his colleague in front of the entire precinct. But Edwards couldn't just let this go. He watched silently for a moment longer, then turned on his heel and headed down the hallway toward Captain Laura Stevens' office. Stevens was the commanding officer at the precinct, known for her no-nonsense attitude and strict adherence to protocol. She was respected, even feared, by some of the officers under her command, not because she was harsh, but because she demanded the highest standards of professionalism and integrity. If there was anyone who could handle this situation with the gravity it deserved, it was Captain Stevens. Edwards reached Stevens' office and knocked on the door, his mind still reeling from what he had seen. After a moment, he heard Stevens' voice from inside, telling him to enter. He opened the door and stepped into the office, finding Stevens at her desk, surrounded by stacks of paperwork and her computer screen glowing with reports. She looked up, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly as she took in Edwards' tense posture. "What is it, Edwards?" she asked, her tone brisk but not unkind. "Captain, we've got a situation," Edwards began, choosing his words carefully. "I think you need to see this. Officer Cross just brought in a man, but it's not just any man. It's Isaiah Thompson, the FBI agent." Stevens' expression shifted immediately, her eyes widening slightly. She knew exactly who Isaiah Thompson was. She had met him briefly during the same training session that Edwards had attended. And like Edwards, she had been impressed by Isaiah's professionalism and the respect he commanded. She knew this was no ordinary arrest, and if Cross had brought Isaiah in under false pretenses, there would be serious repercussions. Without wasting another moment, Stevens stood up from her desk and motioned for Edwards to follow her. They made their way through the station, heading toward the booking area where Cross was still finishing up the paperwork for Isaiah's arrest. When Stevens entered the room, the officers present fell silent, recognizing the seriousness in her expression. Cross, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere, barely glanced up from the computer as he continued typing. But when he saw Stevens approaching, her face set in a stern expression, he finally paused. "Captain," Cross greeted, his tone neutral, though he couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. Stevens didn't waste time on pleasantries. Her eyes moved from Cross to Isaiah, who stood quietly, his wrists still cuffed. She took in the sight of the FBI agent standing there, calm but restrained, and a flicker of anger passed over her features. She turned back to Cross, her voice cold and controlled. "Do you have any idea who you just arrested?" she asked, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. Cross frowned, clearly confused. "He was acting suspicious, Captain. I had every reason to believe." Stevens cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. "That man is Isaiah Thompson. He's a high-ranking agent with the FBI, and you arrested him without cause." For a moment, Cross was speechless. He blinked as if trying to process what Stevens had just said. Isaiah Thompson? FBI? None of this made sense. In his mind, he had been justified in his actions. He had followed his instincts, and his instincts had told him that Isaiah was up to something. But now, hearing the truth, the weight of his mistake came crashing down on him. Cross's face paled as he stared at Isaiah, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had done. The arrogance that had fueled his actions drained away, leaving behind only disbelief in the creeping realization that his career, his reputation, and everything he had worked for was now in jeopardy. How could he have been so wrong? Isaiah remained calm, his eyes meeting Cross's without a trace of anger. There was no need for him to gloat, no need for him to rub it in. The situation spoke for itself. He had known that the truth would come to light eventually, and now that it had, he felt no satisfaction in seeing Cross squirm under the weight of his own actions. This wasn't about winning or losing. This was about something much bigger, about the systemic biases that had led to this moment in the first place. Stevens took a deep breath, her gaze shifting between Cross and Isaiah before she made her decision. "Get those cuffs off him," she ordered, her voice firm. One of the other officers quickly moved forward to uncuff Isaiah, the metal releasing with a soft click. As Isaiah rubbed his wrists, Stevens turned her full attention to Cross. "We'll deal with this in my office," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "But make no mistake, there will be consequences for this." Cross nodded stiffly, his throat tight with shame. He had no words, no defense. He had acted on prejudice, not evidence, and now he would have to face the fallout. Isaiah stood tall, his composure never wavering. He knew that the situation wasn't over. There would be an investigation, and there would be fallout, not just for Cross, but for the entire department. But as he looked around the room, he saw the discomfort in the faces of the other officers, the way they avoided his gaze. It wasn't just about Cross. It was about all of them. And Isaiah knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger conversation about accountability and reform. As Stevens led Cross away, Isaiah remained behind, watching them go. He didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. He felt determined to ensure that this incident wouldn't be swept under the rug, that it wouldn't just be another story of racial profiling forgotten in a few weeks. He would make sure of it. In the days that followed the arrest, Officer David Cross was placed on administrative leave. The precinct's walls felt colder and quieter, without the daily routine that had defined his life for over 20 years. As he sat in his small living room, surrounded by the silence of his own thoughts, the weight of his actions pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. The television, usually his go-to distraction from the stress of the job, remained off. Even the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall grated on his nerves. Cross had never imagined that his career would come to such a screeching halt, especially not like this. He was no stranger to disciplinary reviews. In his years on the force, he had been through a few, mostly minor infractions or procedural issues that were quickly resolved. But this was different. This wasn't about a minor mistake or a paperwork error. This was about something much larger, something he had never truly confronted before. For years, Cross had operated under the belief that his instincts were infallible. He had seen so much, dealt with so many types of people, that he believed he could spot trouble from a mile away. But now, as he sat alone, the events of that day in the park played over and over in his mind. He remembered the way Isaiah Thompson had looked at him, calm, composed, almost expectant. It was as if Isaiah had known what was coming, as if he had seen it all before. And Cross knew, deep down, that he had arrested Isaiah not because of any real threat or crime, but because of his own unexamined biases. His thoughts were interrupted by the knock on the door. Cross dragged himself up from the couch and opened it to see a plainclothes officer delivering the official notice from Internal Affairs. It was time for the review, time for Cross to face the consequences of his actions. The day of the review arrived, and the atmosphere in the precinct was tense. Cross entered the meeting room with a heavy heart, fully aware that his career was hanging by a thread. Seated at the head of the table was Captain Laura Stevens, her expression as unreadable as ever. Beside her were representatives from Internal Affairs, their faces stoic as they prepared to dissect every detail of the incident. But the person who drew Cross's attention the most was Isaiah Thompson, sitting at the opposite end of the table, his posture upright and his demeanor calm. Isaiah's presence felt larger than life, not because of his physical stature, but because of the quiet authority he exuded. As the review began, Cross was asked to recount his version of events. His voice was strained as he spoke. The confidence that had once defined him now diminished. He explained his actions, trying to justify them with the vague description of a suspect he believed Isaiah had matched. But as the words left his mouth, even he could hear how hollow they sounded. The truth was that he hadn't had any real reason to arrest Isaiah, other than the nagging feeling that something was off. That feeling, he now realized, had been fueled by his own unconscious bias, not by any evidence or logical reasoning. The room was silent as Cross finished his explanation. The officers from Internal Affairs exchanged glances, but it was Isaiah who spoke next. His voice was calm and measured, just as it had been in the park. But there was a sharpness to his words, a precision that cut through the air like a blade. "This isn't about what happened to me," Isaiah said, his gaze fixed on Cross. "This is about the larger issue at play here. What I experienced is not unique. It's part of a pattern of racial profiling that has been allowed to fester in law enforcement for far too long. Officer Cross didn't arrest me because of any legitimate suspicion. He arrested me because of the assumptions he made about me based on the color of my skin. And that's a problem, not just for him, but for the entire system." Isaiah's words hung in the air, and the room remained silent as everyone processed the gravity of what he had said. Cross could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He had thought of himself as a good cop, someone who was fair and just. But now he saw that he had been blind to the biases that had shaped his decisions for years. He hadn't just made a mistake, he had been part of the problem. Isaiah continued, his voice steady but firm. I'm not here to seek revenge. I'm here because this can't keep happening. Officers need to be held accountable for their actions, and there needs to be a deeper understanding of how racial bias influences policing. This isn't just about individual officers. It's about the culture of law enforcement that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. As Isaiah spoke, Cross couldn't help but feel a sense of shame wash over him. He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that he was doing the right thing. But now, sitting across from the man he had wrongfully arrested, he realized just how wrong he had been. It wasn't just about Isaiah. It was about all the other people he had judged unfairly over the years, all the times he had acted on instinct without questioning the deeper biases that influenced those instincts. The review continued, with internal affairs dissecting every detail of Cross's actions that day. They questioned his judgment, his decision-making, and the assumptions he had made. Cross tried to defend himself, but each time his words felt weaker and weaker. The more he spoke, the more he realized that there was no real defense for what he had done. He had acted out of bias, plain and simple. By the end of the review, it was clear that Cross's fate had been sealed. Captain Stevens looked at him with a mix of disappointment and resolve. She had always been a firm believer in holding her officers to the highest standards, and she knew that this situation could not be ignored or swept under the rug. We will be conducting a full investigation, Stevens said, her voice cold and authoritative. But based on the facts presented here today, it's clear that Officer Cross's actions were not only unprofessional, but also rooted in racial bias. Effective immediately, Officer Cross is terminated from his position with the department. The words hit Cross like a punch to the gut. He had known this was coming, but hearing it said aloud made it real in a way that he hadn't fully prepared for. His career, the career he had dedicated his life to, was over. There would be no second chances, no opportunity to redeem himself. The weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. As Cross sat there, stunned by the finality of Stephen's words, Isaiah stood up. He gathered his things, preparing to leave the room. But before he left, he turned to Cross, his expression unreadable. I hope you take this as an opportunity to reflect, Isaiah said quietly. This isn't just about your career. It's about understanding the harm that comes from unchecked bias. We all have a role to play in making things better. I hope you can find a way to do that, even if it's not as a cop. With that, Isaiah left the room, leaving Cross to sit in the silence of his own thoughts. In the days that followed, Cross found himself in a state of limbo. His routine, which had once been defined by the rhythms of the precinct and the demands of the job, had been upended. He no longer had the structure or sense of purpose that his career had provided. Now he was left with nothing but time and the uncomfortable task of confronting his own failings. Cross began reading. At first, it was out of a sense of obligation, a need to understand what had gone wrong and how he had allowed himself to become so blind. He started with articles about implicit bias, about how race can unconsciously shape decision-making in ways that people often don't realize. The more he read, the more he saw himself in the pages, in the stories of officers who had made the same mistakes he had. It was a painful realization, but it was one he knew he had to face. Meanwhile, Isaiah Thompson continued his work, though the incident with Cross remained fresh in his mind. He had seen firsthand how deep the problem of racial bias ran within law enforcement, and he knew that this was just one small victory in a much larger battle. He continued to meet with Captain Stevens, pushing for deeper reforms within the department. They discussed new training programs and increased accountability measures and ways to improve community relations. Isaiah's focus wasn't on punishing individual officers. It was on addressing the systemic issues that allowed racial profiling and bias to thrive in the first place. He wanted to see real change, not just in this precinct, but across the country. And while he knew that change wouldn't come overnight, he was determined to keep pushing. One afternoon, as Isaiah was leaving the precinct after another meeting with Stevens, he spotted Cross across the street. Cross was standing by his car, his face lined with exhaustion and regret. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and though neither man said a word, the exchange spoke volumes. There was no anger in Isaiah's gaze, no need for retribution. There was only the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, Cross could learn from his mistakes. As Cross drove away, Isaiah turned back to the precinct, his mind already focused on the next steps. The work was far from over, but he knew that progress had been made. It wasn't just about one officer's termination. It was about the broader shift that was beginning to take hold. And for the first time in a long while, Isaiah felt hopeful. The road ahead was long, but it was a road worth traveling.